puzzles that are 400 years old, that are so convoluted and complicated, it's very hard to understand what he's trying to say. I had one man write me right after the book first came out, and he said he had spent 4 years working on one quatrain. So I respect those people who use their own intellect trying to figure out what the puzzles are. And as I said when I spoke on this before, when this all began, I didn't even know what a quatrain was. There's 1,000 of these that Nostradamus wrote. A quatrain is a 4-line poem, or in the case of Nostradamus, it's a 4-line puzzle or prophecy. And he wrote almost 1,000 that have come down to our time. We've found out since then that he actually wrote many more that were destroyed, or they were contaminated by mixing them together. So a lot of them have not made it down to our time. So there were actually more than the 1,000. But that's a great deal of information. And many of them, a great number of them, have never been understood. And other ones have understood after they occurred. And of course, when we were communicating with him and doing the sessions, he kept saying, "This is so simple. Why don't we understand it? I was not complicated." He gives us more credit than we are worth, because his mind is remarkable, the way he has put these together, the codes he has used. And that's why it took me 3 years to do all of them. And those were not 3 years of continuous work, because there were breaks in between as the people came and went during the entire experience. Because it was not constant work, but working with the different people that were involved, it took 3 years, and it ended up that he came through about 12 different people before we were finally finished. But through all of these people, he gave us the same story, the same scenario, the same visions of our future that he wanted us to know. It was always the same scenarios. Even though the people I worked with did not know what I was working on, they did not know the information I'd already uncovered. They just gave more pieces of the puzzle as we translated and interpreted the different quatrains. And it was my job, as I wrote the book, to put it all together. It ended up taking this computer to put it together because there was so much information. And I had to try to arrange it in some kind of a chronological order, because I found when I began reading the quatrains to Nostradamus, as he wanted me to do, and he would tell me what they meant, that they were in no particular order. He did this on purpose. He said he did it to further confuse the Inquisition, and he threw dice trying to figure out which order they were going to go in and which tile. He put them in tiles, and then he tried to organize them very randomly, he said, by throwing dice. So even if I had started at the beginning of the book that is in our hands now, that has come down to our time, the books of all the quatrains, even if I had begun in the beginning and read them straight through, we wouldn't have got the right order, because they are not in chronological order. They are all mixed up. So it ended up taking the computer, and I tried to put everything together, which was really a monumental job, and that's why it took so long. The first book came out in 1989, and the second one, I believe, was the year later, and then it was a few years after that before it came out with Volume 3. Now, the last time we spoke, I talked about how the extraordinary, unbelievable contact took place with Nostradamus when I was working with the young girl. Well, not young girl, she's a woman, she had 10 children, but I was working with her, and she went back to a lifetime where she was a student of Nostradamus in the 1500s. And that was when I didn't know, I knew of who he was, and I knew something about the quatrains, but I'd never read any of them. But I didn't know anything about his life. And later when I did the research, I found that he did have students. But there's only a very few mentioned in his biography, mostly the one who was with him during the last years of his life and when he died. And a lot of these scholars have tried to say that was the only student he had. That's not true. I found out more about his life than the scholars know. He had many students that he taught, and they had to meet in secret, because if the Inquisition would have found out what they were doing, they would have been killed, or their land would have been taken away, and they would have been thrown into prison. They had to be extremely careful, because this was considered working with the devil. Nostradamus was a doctor, so he had these people meet with him in secret, under the disguise of just teaching them medicine. He couldn't let anyone know he was actually teaching them metaphysical things. He was teaching them how to see the future, how to go into trance and see the future, and also how to, some of the ways he was doing his medical cures. Because there were many spies in those days wanting to know how he was able to do these miraculous healings that he did in his lifetime. Anything he was doing was totally against what they had been taught in medicine in those days. And they wanted to find out how he was doing this. And so they said he had to be working with the devil. Now, I know from my work where he got the information he used to heal people in those days. A lot of it came from seeing the visions of the future. But he was able to see some of the healings we have now and use some of the cures to apply to his time period. And during the session, even the sessions we had, sometimes he would ask me to give a cure for a certain problem. He says, how would you do this in your time? Well, I didn't know how to do it, but the answer would always come. As I always said, I think it comes from them. Because when we were doing this, we had a person involved who was called the guardian. And he was the guardian of the tapestry room to allow us to do this. Because he said, what you are doing by traveling through time and entering into another person's life while they are alive is totally against the rules, against the laws of the universe. But we know your purpose, so we're allowing you to do this. So when we entered into his life, we were allowed to have the information. And if Nostradamus needed medical information, it would come. It would be supplied to him. So this is why I think he was able to get a lot of his information for medical purposes by seeing these things in the future. And also he said one of the ways he could stop pain and stop bleeding was a highly advanced form of hypnosis that he had developed himself. But these were things that the average person was not to know because they considered it working with the devil. But anyway, this woman went back to where she was a student of his during that time period, and that's how the entire adventure began. And then I told you last time about how she came to a point in her life where she moved away because this was all too much for her. When we had the contact with Nostradamus, and he said he had an assignment for me. He said, I want you to find the book. You could see there was a book that had come down to our time period that had all of his prophecies in it. And he wanted me to find the book and to read them to him, the quatrains one by one, and he would explain them in modern-day language, tell me what they meant, what the prophecy concerned, and what time period was involved. And he wanted me to get this information to the world. And this was the assignment he was giving me. Well, when the woman woke up and we told her all of this, she was so upset by it that she moved to Alaska. And she had been from Alaska, but I think she wanted to get back. She wanted to put as much distance between me and her as she could after this came out because she did not want to do any part in it. So she moved to Alaska. I'm repeating a little bit from the last time we spoke because I want to backtrack for those who have not heard that other part or to catch up on where I was. Anyway, but before she left, we had time for one more session. And it happened again, and he came through again, and he said, you must do this work. It is urgent, it is imperative to your time period that these prophecies be translated and brought forth into your time, because the time is now when these things are going to happen. And he said nobody has understood, and nobody has had the correct translation. So I told him, yes, it's all very well and good, but this person is moving away. I can't work with her anymore. And he said, that doesn't matter. Now that we have made this contact, I will come through anybody you work with. That's a big statement because I work with a lot of people. And he gave me instructions on how to locate him and a test or training that I was to use to be sure I was really speaking to him. And then the woman moved away. And after that, I wrote the first 4 chapters of Conversations with Nostradamus, Volume 1, not knowing if it was going anywhere. It might have just been an interesting incident that would go into a book on miscellaneous regression sometime in the future. Of course, that chapter or whatever I was going to do on miscellaneous regression turned into a 3-volume set. So, anyway, this was the instructions he gave me. So, not knowing what was going to happen, I just waited about 3 months. Then I tried the experiment on a woman who was a very good subject. And I had worked with experimentation with her for many years. And I believe I told in the last broadcast about how we were doing remote viewing before it was even called that. I didn't even know what it was. All I knew was I was able to take people in trance and have them go to other countries and see incidents that were happening at that time and to tell us what was going on. We were able to do this a lot, especially with these good subjects. And Brenda, the music student, was one of the ones that I was using in the remote viewing experiment. It was highly effective. She found information, especially about the Chernobyl disaster, that was not known until many years later whenever the Russians finally released the information that they had, that they've been holding for such a long time, about the degree of radiation and the people that have been killed. A lot of these things were not released at the time, but yet we knew what had happened on that morning when it was going on because I had taken Brenda to Chernobyl to see and to report back on what was happening. So I knew this was possible to do this, and I knew that she was an excellent subject. So I asked her, went to her house one night, late at night, after the first woman had moved away to Alaska. I went to Brenda's house late at night, and I said, do you want to try an experiment? She said, sure, just tell me what we did when I wake up. So then I followed Nostradamus' instructions to locate him, and it worked. There he was, the same man, in the same room, and he said, well, I've been waiting for you. Now can we get started? Of course, that night I was completely blown away, not even knowing. I didn't want to cover the translations. I just began asking questions about Nostradamus and his life. It was really one of the greatest adventures I've ever had when we made the contact with him.